Hello, and welcome to this talk on our latest exhibition here in Kilmainham Gaol, Hearts Ne'er Waver, the Women Prisoners of the Irish Civil War. My name is Brian Crowley, and along with my colleague Aoife Torpey, we'll be, I suppose, talking you through the exhibition virtually, but we're delighted to be part of the History Festival organised by Clare County Libraries. So the exhibition marks or was organised to, I suppose, mark the centenary of the imprisonment of women in Kilmainham Gaol in 1923. However, the exhibition covers the imprisonment of women throughout the Civil War, which largely began in about November 1922, when the first women are arrested and are held. And the exhibition, as I said, concentrates quite a lot on Kilmainham Gaol, but covers the broader story as well. Uh, the exhibition is divided into four main sections. So this room here that you're looking at now on screen, this is I suppose, the introductory section where I suppose we explain why women were arrested in such number during the Civil War. We believe over 600 women were arrested in 1922 and 23. This is really unprecedented and completely unlike what happened after the 1916 Rising and during the War of Independence. So the exhibition features quite a lot of material relating to these women from the collection here in Kilmainham Gaol. Actually, most of the material we'll be looking at is material from our own collection. It's really one of the great strengths of the Kilmainham Gaol Museum collection. And the first thing I thought we might look at, again, looking at, I suppose, the role of women during the Civil War, particularly in the early days and weeks of the Civil War. This is a Red Cross armband made by a woman called Bridie Klein, and she used this in the Four Courts in 1922. The Four Courts is first occupied in April of that year, and it is the attack on the Four Courts by the Free State Army at the end of June 1922 that really sets off the Civil War proper. Now, there's an interesting story behind the choice of this Red Cross armband. We have a number of these in our collection of these homemade Red Cross armbands. And the reason we chose this one is it featured in an artwork done by a woman called Margot McNulty, who I suppose partnered with us on this exhibition. She created a body of work for an exhibition called Voices, which I suppose runs in parallel and speaks to the historical exhibition. And we knew that this is one of the items that she used, so we decided, well, this is the one we'll pick then to include in the exhibition. Interestingly, it turns out, and unbeknownst to us at the time, that Bridie Klein actually was a prisoner in Kilmainham Gaol during the Civil War. And the reason we weren't aware of it is she gave a false name. She gave the name of Anne Hardwick when she was arrested. So it's a really lovely bit of serendipity. As I mentioned, we have this parallel exhibition of artworks done by Margot McNulty. Margot lives in the Midlands now, but is originally from Achill in the west of Ireland. And she had come to the jail for over a year in advance of the centenary to look at our collection of material relating to women during the Civil War. And Margot was actually lucky enough to be awarded a Markovich grant to produce this body of work. And as I suppose this body of work progressed, and as we began to talk more, we came up with this idea that we would show both exhibitions in parallel. So on one side of the space, we have Margot's I suppose the historical work, and on the other we have Margot's paintings and photo engravings. So you can see here, these are the pieces inspired by those Red Cross armbands. And again, Margot picked up an echo with the bars on one of the windows of the jail from the west wing of Kilmainham. in addition to those photo engravings, which often feature items from our collection, she has done a series of paintings as well, and they're hung around the mezzanine area of the museum. And here again, you can see more of these photo engravings, and many of these objects are actually objects featured in the exhibition. So it's very interesting to see how her artwork, I suppose, speaks to the items on display. It's also, we felt kind of very fitting because so many of the women used art as a way of, I think, deriving comfort and I suppose coping with the experience of incarceration during the Civil War. And then just another view of some more of Margot's paintings. So as I said, we have these two exhibitions kind of running in parallel, and I think in many ways feeding off each other as well, and having a dialogue in lots and lots of interesting ways. So if we go back to, I suppose, to the historical exhibition, one of the images that we feature in the exhibition is this photograph of the funeral cortege of the funeral of Cathal Brugha. This is the funeral cortege as it moves along Ormond Quay in Dublin in July of 1922. Cathal Brugha was one of the, I suppose, one of the heroes of the 1916 Rising. During the Civil War, he took the Republican or anti-treaty side, and after the fall of the Four Courts, the Republicans there, a lot of them retreated to O'Connell Street, to the northeast side, kind of roughly where I suppose the Gresham Hotel and the Savoy Cinema are today, and occupied a number of buildings there. And it was in a street just at the back of that block that Cathal Brugha was shot in the early days of July. When the funeral was organised, his widow, Kathleen Brugha, specifically asked that only women take part in the Guard of Honour. And of course, any Republican men who I suppose were a fighting age of the time, if they had turned up for that funeral, they would have risked being arrested themselves. So in some ways, the women take the place of what I suppose in other times would have been a role carried out by the members of the Irish Volunteers or the IRA at the time. So, as I said, you can start to see the prominence of women as the men are no longer able to, I suppose, organize in public. And also you can see as well that women are particularly playing a role in, I suppose, propaganda events and events that are have the potential to influence public opinion. And on that theme, again, looking at things like propaganda, this is a Republican anti-treaty news sheet or magazine or newspaper, the Republican War Bulletin from September of 1922. And you can see on the front there's an illustration of a group, they would appear to be kind of anti-treaty Republican members of the IRA, looking down at a convoy of Free State military. This drawing was actually done by Countess Markovich. Markovich, she was actually a trained artist. She had studied in the Slade School in London and also at the Académie Julienne in Paris, which is actually where she met her husband, Casimir Markovich. And she's a very skilled artist and was able to turn her hand to creating these kind of propaganda pieces. But again, women in these early months of the Civil War are playing a key role, not just in producing images like this, but also often as journalists writing the stories that are appearing in the Republican press, often an underground press with newspapers and publications that are being banned by the Free State government. So, as I mentioned earlier, you start to see the arrest of women around November 1922, and arrests then continue into 1923. This is, I suppose, a draft letter written by a woman called Dolly Jeffers. She was arrested on the 6th of March 1923. And this is a letter written to the governor of Kilmainham Gaol, where she's being held at the time. And in it, she's complaining about her treatment when she was arrested, the fact that her property, she had a suitcase with her with some of her personal possessions, I suppose more a briefcase. And she's also has concerns around some money that she had on her person that was taken from her, and she's demanding that her property be returned to her. And it would seem that her money and her property were returned because along with this draft letter that she prepared, we also have a tag that was attached to her possessions when it was returned to her. So we're moving on now into, I suppose, the next room, and this room looks at very much how the women organise themselves once they find themselves in Kilmainham Gaol. As I said, I've been talking quite a lot about Kilmainham Gaol. Initially, a lot of the women were held in Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, and in 1923, in addition to Kilmainham Gaol, there was also the North Dublin Union. This is a former workhouse located in the kind of Stony Batter, Grangegorman area of Dublin, and it was set up as a kind of a female internment camp as well, and ran in parallel with Kilmainham Gaol. So the first item we're going to have a look at is a diary kept by a woman called Maura Redmond when she was in both Kilmainham Gaol and the North Dublin Union. And she kept this diary between March and July 1923. This is a relatively recent acquisition. We're very fortunate to have a number of kind of personal diaries and memoirs and accounts by women like Hannah Moynihan, Sis and Joe Power, two sisters from Tralee, also kept a diary. As far as we know, there's only one published. That was The Jangle of the Keys by Margaret Buckley, and that was published in 1938. This diary, on the other hand, is very much kind of a personal diary kept by a young woman. She's, I suppose, relatively junior in the movement, which makes it in some ways all the more interesting because you really get a sense of what it was like for these ordinary women. She's also, what comes across in this diary is just how young she is, and she's she's excited and intimidated by some of her experience in equal measure. This particular entry, which is you can see here on these pages, is the 24th and 25th of March 1923. One of the things she records is that Mammy came to window. She seemed to have fur coat on. I was glad to see her. So what we think she's referring to here is a way that the prisoners developed to communicate with one another. This is Communicating with Prisoners by Jack B. Yates, which dates from roughly 1924. And it's believed to show Kilmainham Gaol, and the prisoners here would go to the top floor of the Victorian East Wing of the jail. And there they would go to the window and were able to call down to people who could gather at the base of the building at the back of the jail. And this was a way that they could see loved ones, as was the case with Maura Redmond and her mother. It was also a way of getting information out of the jail and getting news in unfiltered by the censor. It seems to vary in terms of the reaction of the authorities to this practice. There is an account in the spring of 1923 that a sentry fired on a group of people who were having a kind of a political meeting or a rally outside the jail and were calling up to the prisoners. And actually a local woman, a young woman from the area, was very badly wounded when she was shot by this sentry. So I said there seems to be kind of a mix of reactions. Jack B. Yates and the Yates family did have a connection with the jail. His sisters, Lily and Lolly Yates, they ran the Coola Press, and among their employees was a young woman called Molly Gill. And Molly Gill was also involved in coming on and was a prisoner in Kilmainham Gaol in 1923. So I said there is also this, I suppose, this kind of personal family connection with the jail, and maybe it was that connection that brought his attention to this event. In terms of organization, as well as, I suppose, day-to-day organization, the women would also arrange particular events. And I think perhaps the most significant and certainly the most elaborate of these was a commemoration of the 7th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, which took place on the 24th of April 1923. Among the female prisoners were a number of relatives of the 1916 leaders. Um, Most notably, Grace Plunkett, who, as Grace Gifford, had married her fiance Joseph Plunkett in the chapel of the jail the night before his execution on the 4th of May 1916. And this was a huge story at the time. It was one of the big stories of the 1916 Rising. And to a certain extent, Grace Plunkett was something of a celebrity when she came to the jail. A lot of the women in their diaries kind of record how excited they were at the prospect of meeting her. Other women with very personal connections with the 1916 leaders was Nora Connolly O'Brien, whose father, James Connolly, had been shot in Stonebreaker's Yard here in the jail, and Lily O'Brennan, who was the sister-in-law of Eamon Kent, another one of the leaders executed here, but she herself had been a prisoner in the jail in 1916. So I suppose in some ways the women are taking advantage of the fact that they have this personal connection, and they're also using this event to make a very personal connection with the 1916 Rising and positioning themselves and their comrades as the true inheritors of the ideals of the 1916 Rising. These programs that you can see here, this program is a program which belonged to Nan Hogan from County Clare, and it kind of details this, as I said, a very extensive commemoration which began at 9 a.m. on the morning of the 24th of April 1923 with a requiem mass in the chapel. Then at 3 p.m. they processed in great solemnity to the Stonebreaker's Yard where the executions had taken place in 1916. Grace Plunkett is the one, naturally enough, laying the laurel wreath in that yard, and then the rosary was recited. They then returned to the east wing of the jail, the large east wing of the jail, and there they unfurled the tricolour, they sang hymns, and then there were a series of speeches from these women who had these kind of direct connection with the 1916 leaders executed in the jail. So Lily O'Brien was followed by Grace Plunkett, and then the proclamation was read by Nora Connolly O'Brien. And then the women renewed their Republican oath. That evening at 7 o'clock, there was a concert and play, so you can see there as well. There's lots of, I suppose, patriotic poems and songs. So poems by Patrick Pearse, but also songs such as the Battle Hymn written by Countess Markievicz. I suppose suitable entertainment for the day that was in it. And then there was a performance of Pearse's play The Singer, which is particularly significant, not just because Pearse was one of the 1916 leaders, but The Singer actually is, I suppose, his idealized account of what of his imagined rising, and the regarded it was a gender blind casting, as you'll see. So the women took the roles, male and female. It then was followed by his famous poem written to his mother possibly in Kilmainham Jail in 1916, and then the singing of the soldier's song, or as we probably know it now, Oral Naveen. And as part of that, as I mentioned, the women renewed their oath to the Irish Republic, again positioning themselves as, I suppose, the inheritors of the Republic. So this is from an autograph book owned by Fanny Kelly, and we think it was probably inscribed by Lily O'Brien. The exhibition, in addition to, I suppose, the artifacts and the panels, we've also reproduced some of the amazing graffiti that the women um, would have drawn on the walls of their cells and on the walls of the jail. One of the pieces that we reproduced is this, I suppose, this prison diary. It was done by Cecilia Gallagher in her cell. And she began it on St. Swithin's Day, which is the 15th of July. And tradition has it, if it rains on St. Swithin's Day, you'll have 40 days of rain. And if it's sunny on St. Swithin's Day, you'll have 40 days of sun. And it turns out that 1923 was not a great summer. It rained on St. Swithin's Day and pretty much rained for 40 days afterwards. Interestingly, we tried to recreate this experience this year in 2023, and the results remained the same. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to hand over to my colleague Aoife Torpey, and Aoife is going to take us through the second half of the exhibition.
So as Brian said, I also worked on this exhibition, and I'm going to take you through the remaining rooms of the exhibition, starting here with this room which looks at resistance. So the women in prison didn't necessarily always get on with the prison authorities. They didn't accept their prison experience quietly. So disputes between the authorities and the prisoners were common, and they could result in clashes. Privileges such as letters and parcels could be stopped over the prisoner's own infractions, but also for events that happened outside of the jail. When problems occurred, the prisoners resisted the regime in any way they could, and this could include destroying prison property or refusing to obey certain prison rules they disagreed with. One of the most extreme forms of resistance that took place was by undertaking hunger strike. The prisoners weaponized their own bodies, the only thing they had available to them. Hunger strike was quite a common occurrence, with some women going on more than one hunger strike during their time in prison. Some of their fellow prisoners disagreed with this, seeing that it was a very extreme very extreme event to take part in, fearing for the very serious risks it posed to the women's health. This report here was compiled by the Prisoners' Council in the North Dublin Union, and it was to be presented to the medical officer, the Free State medical officer in charge of the prisoners, and it regards the treatment of several women who were on hunger strike in the North Dublin Union. 4 of them, Maura Whelan, Chrissy Behan, Maura Duggan and May Leach. These 4 women had been removed from their dormitories where they were with their fellow prisoners and put on solitary confinement in a part of the union where their fellow prisoners couldn't access them. The Prisoners' Council massively objected to this. The women didn't have anyone to attend to them, and as they were on hunger strike, they needed someone there. They even accused one of the soldier guards of having burst into one of the rooms and threatened to throw one of the girls out of the window unless she agreed to take food. It was also noted in the report, however, that these women had undertaken the hunger strike against the Prisoners' Council's wishes, so the women were not always united in and of themselves. The 4 women on hunger strike were eventually released, but clashes like this between the prisoners and the authorities were common. One of the most infamous events of dispute that took place in 1923 was the forced removal of a number of prisoners from Kilmainham Gaol to the North Dublin Union on the night of the 30th of April 1923. The women were informed earlier that day that they were going to be moved, but as 2 of their number, Mary McSweeney and Kathleen O'Callaghan, were on hunger strike, they refused to be moved. They didn't want to leave the 2 women alone. They decided, once their demands were not met, they demanded that the women be released immediately. When this didn't happen, they decided to resist. They went up onto the top floor of the East Wing, they linked arms, and they held on to the bars. Soldiers and members of the CID, the Criminal Investigative Department, were brought in at night time. They had their faces covered or blacked, and they began to drag the women down the stairs one by one in an operation that took several hours. It was a very violent event. There was screams and all sorts of terrors. The women were pulled down by their hair. Some had their heads hit off the stairs or were crushed against the railings. Some gave as good as they got. They hit the soldiers with their suitcases or gave them a kick of the boot. But this account here, entitled The Kilmainham Tortures, Experiences of a Prisoner, was written by Dorothy McCardle, one of those women who was moved, the day after the event on the 1st of May 1923. And she describes the violence meted out to the women. And she herself says that a great hand closed on my face, blinding me and stifling me, and thrust me back down to the ground among trampling feet. In the midst of all this chaos, the two women, Kathleen O'Callaghan and Mary McSweeney, were actually released. And having had their demands met, the remaining prisoners in the East Wing went quietly without any further conflict. Dorothy McCardle was actually released from from the North Dublin Union only a few days after she arrived. And so her account, this account here, appeared in the newspapers, in Era newspaper on the 26th of May 1923. So it actually became a very good propaganda piece that they were treating women like this. Autograph books were very common amongst the prisoners. They were common in normal life, but the prisoners also had them sent in parcels. They handed them round to their fellow prisoners to inscribe and to sign. They were very conscious that they were part of something historic, and they wanted their own personal mementos of these events. This particular autograph book belonged to Nan Hogan, who Brian already mentioned. She was from Cratloe in County Clare and was one of a number of women arrested in February 1923 for trying to free prisoners from Limerick jail. So she was brought up to Dublin, where she was held in Kilmainham jail and went on hunger strike, and then was later brought to the North Dublin Union. She was released from the North Dublin Union in July 1923. In 1924, she married a man called Tim Foley, but unfortunately she was dead by June 1924 as a result of complications from pregnancy. Her family attribute her early death to her experiences in prison. While in prison, Nan Hogan seems to have become quite friendly with Grace Gifford Plunkett. And this illustration here is by Grace Gifford Plunkett, and also the poem as well. Grace was quite sought after to sign books, not only because of her association with Joseph Plunkett and her tragic marriage story, but also because she was a very talented artist. This picture here depicts several women holding vigil outside one of the jails. This was a common sight, worried family members being outside the prison, particularly during the hunger strikes. The woman kneeling on the right in black may be Charlotte Despard, who was a common sight outside the jails. She was a member of the Women's Prisoners Defence League, which was founded in 1922 to provide support and assistance to the prisoners and their families. She was an unlikely Republican. She was a part of a wealthy British family, and her brother, Sir John French, was actually the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland between 1918 and 1921. But Charlotte Despard was a socialist, a suffragette, and a Republican. Escape weighed heavily on many of the prisoners' minds, and there were multiple escape attempts throughout 1922 and 1923. In the summer of 1923, the women began to dig a tunnel in Kilmainham jail. They managed to get into the basement laundry of the West Wing, the oldest part of the jail, where they managed to pry up one of the flagstones and begin to dig down through the earth using their hands and also the prison issue spoons. So the photograph there you can see is of the remains of that tunnel a few years later. So you can see they did manage to make quite a bit of headway. They would cover up the sound of digging by their other prisoners playing boisterous games in the nearby yards. And they also came up with a very inventive musical warning system. They would sing Kevin Barry when danger was coming, and when the coast was clear, they would sing O'Donnell Aboo. Unfortunately, the matron did eventually discover the tunnel, and she went to the prisoners' OC, officer commanding, Margaret Buckley, and said that she had found their hole. Margaret Buckley was disgusted, not because the tunnel had been discovered, but because the matron described it as a hole, because for her this was their hopes and dreams. It wasn't just a hole. Sheila Humphreys, who was one of the excavators, wasn't cowed by this, and she left this graffiti. You can see a picture of it there, giving successors the location of the tunnel and also wishing them very good luck. Though there were moments of great excitement and occasional danger, life in prison was boring and monotonous. The reality was that the women didn't know how long they would be in prison, and they just had to make the best of it. They occupied their time in a variety of ways through educational classes, particularly Irish language, creative activities such as knitting, painting, embroidery, writing stories and poetry, and communal events such as ceilidhs and concerts. So this last room in our exhibition looks at what prison life was like. What was their daily life in jail? This is another Grace Gifford Plunkett drawing. This is of the Kilmainham Gaol Chapel, and she drew this again for Nan Hogan, so they do seem to have become quite friendly. It's a sketch of the Roman Catholic chapel in Kilmainham Gaol, which was a very poignant subject choice for Grace, as it's where she had married Joseph the night before his execution. It's also framed behind a piece of glass taken from a cell window in Kilmainham Gaol, so it's a very physical memento of the women's prison experience. We actually are very lucky to have this object on loan to us by the family of Nan Hogan for the duration of the exhibition. So it's wonderful to be able to display it in public. So that's really, we're very lucky to have it. It also shows the importance of religion in the prisoners' lives. They were actually denied the sacraments or absolution by the Catholic Church, who had excommunicated them as Republican prisoners, but they still attended masses when they were available, and they even set up their own altars where they kept vigil, particularly during the hunger strikes. Throughout their imprisonment, the women organised numerous events, ceilidhs, concerts, and fancy dress parties. This souvenir programme is from an evening of an evening celebration held in Kilmainham Gaol on the 19th of August 1923. It was a full programme. The women of the East Wing were the hosts, but the women of the West Wing were not to be outdone, and they put on a historical pageant. So the evening began with a procession of the women of the West Wing dressed as various historical figures and saints, including St. Patrick, wearing a cloak made from a borrowed sheet illustrated with crayons. There was Robert Emmet and his sweetheart Sarah Curran, along with Anne Devlin. And there was Silken Thomas, who was wearing a robe made from a borrowed silk robe. After the procession had ended, the women settled down to watch a play put on by the women of the East Wing. The scenes included Kathleen Ní Húlahone by W.B. Yeats, as well as The Rising of the Moon, along with dances and songs. After the programme had ended, refreshments were served in the cells, and then carriages were called at midnight, and the women of the West Wing returned to their own section. Other events throughout Kilmainham and the North Dublin Union included fancy dress parties where the costumes were very carefully chosen and talked about. The women also worked out their energy in daily exercise. So some of the prisoners would conduct regimented physical drill, military drill, but mostly they just played games. Popular choices were the Gaelic games rounders and handball because they required little equipment. Recreational equipment wasn't provided by the authorities, but the women could get things like balls sent into them in parcels. And then the rounder's bat in Kilmainham Gaol was actually made from a chair leg by Sheila Humphreys. So that's the small bat you can see there. Sheila Humphreys kept the bat after she left Kilmainham Gaol. This image here, entitled The Darker Side of Things in Jail, Last Ball Gone Over, shows one of those games in progress in Kilmainham Gaol. One of the occupational hazards of playing rounders was that the high ball might go over the very high walls of Kilmainham Gaol and you wouldn't get it back. Sometimes the sentry could be convinced to retrieve it for you, but if he didn't, unfortunately, that was game over. So this drawing here shows all of the players watching as that very last ball flies out of sight, except for one poor figure who is hanging her head in shame, and she's identified as the culprit. This is taken from an autograph book belonging to a woman called Jenny Coyle. Craft work was also a common pastime. The women occupied themselves in knitting, embroidery, crochet, using materials sent into them in parcels. This flag is believed to have been made in Kilmainham Gaol in 1923 by Bridget Brophy, Essie Snuddy, Nellie Woods and Peg Whelan, all of whom were members of Carlow Cumann. The women took it with them when they left the jail, and in subsequent years it was draped over the coffins of numerous Carlow Republicans, including all of the women who made it. It was actually last used in the funeral of Carlow woman Mary Malone in 1997, and it left Kilmainham Gaol Museum to serve this purpose. It was one of the conditions of its presentation to the jail that it be used again. You may have noticed, or you may not have noticed, the flag is actually the wrong way around. It's orange, white, and green. As it was intended to be placed on a coffin, it wouldn't have been so obvious. But when we were choosing to display it, we had to decide which way to do it, because the Cumann symbol in this middle should be the other way around. This has been a very quick look at our exhibition. We have many other items on display, but we wanted to show you some of the highlights of the exhibition. So thank you very much for listening.